So it's his inexhaustibility in the sense that he creates a world?
Yeah, we'll talk about Finnegan's Wake later maybe, but that one day in Dublin, June 16, 1904, everything is happening. It's a very ordinary day, to quote Edna O'Brien again, a day when nothing and everything is happening. But in that day, Bloom goes to a funeral, and he goes to a maternity hospital to visit a woman friend who's in labor. So you have birth and death. He visits a whorehouse and he visits a church. He visits a newspaper office where they're all quoting outstandingly hilarious examples of pompous political speeches. And he passes through the library where they're all discussing Shakespeare. Everything is going on at once in Ulysses, every aspect of human life. Bloom defecates in chapter 4, masturbates in chapter 12, and urinates in chapter 17. And, you know, everything that happens in an ordinary day.
And according to Joyce's own descriptions, what was he trying to do with this text?
Well, Joyce was not much given to explaining himself. He dropped hints. It seems to me one of Joyce's major motives consisted of trying to push realism to the point where it refutes itself. He'd read and been very heavily influenced by a lot of naturalistic writers, Zola, Thomas Hardy, and especially the plays of Henrik Ibsen. Ibsen, of course, gradually moved from naturalism to expressionism as his career went on. But Joyce felt that if he pushed realism far enough, it would collapse upon itself. The closest you can get to realism, it seems, in literature, is the style Joyce uses in most of Ulysses, which is the interior monologue. You're inside one person's head and you're perceiving the world as that person perceives it. Then you jump to somebody else's head, the style changes, and you're perceiving the same day from an entirely different perspective. So the closer you get to realism, the more you realize there is no reality. There are realities plural, or reality tunnels, to quote Timothy Leary. Leary, by the way, said Joyce's prose prepared, to quote, give the exact words, Joyce's prose prepared me to enter psychedelic space. I would say that Joyce is best read while you're stoned, and if you've never had a psychedelic, reading Joyce is the next best equivalent. Yositani Roshi, with whom I studied Zen briefly, I don't mean to claim I got very far with it, but I studied briefly with Yositani Roshi. He said once, there's nothing special about Satori. You do it every night in your sleep. Zen is just a trick for doing it while you're awake. Well, you might say Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are two other tricks for doing it while you're awake.
Doing what?
Achieving full recognition of the difference between the map and the territory, or between your subjective evaluations, which you can be sure of, they're since your own, and the objective reality, which you can never be sure of. All you can know is your own subjective interpretations of objective reality. You can only know the map. You can never fully know the territory. Besides, the territory is changing all the time. Universe is none simultaneously apprehended.
Now, is Joyce denounced as a terrorist?
Well, as a matter of fact, frequently he was, yes. A lot of the first criticisms of Ulysses were denouncing it for its obscenity and blasphemy, which was just Joyce being naturalistic. This is the way people talk, these are the things people do, and so on. And if the fiction has never dared face up to it before, well, if you want realism, I'll give you realism, until it collapses on itself, as I said. One recent article defined Joyce as a one-man literary IRA. In a sense, Ulysses destroys English literature, because the whole history of English literature is parodied in one part of Ulysses or another. T.S. Eliot said Ulysses demonstrates the futility of all styles. No matter what style you write in, you're not conveying reality, you're conveying a style. And so Joyce does parodies of Morte d'Arthur, Dickens, Swift. The whole history of English literature is in Ulysses. And every framework changes the way you see the events of that one day in Dublin. You can always find clues as to the objective reality behind all these reality tunnels, but you can never fully define it. For instance, Bloom is carrying on a romantic correspondence with an unknown woman. He signs himself Henry Flower, and it's quite obvious he does not intend to meet this woman ever. He doesn't want to have a sexual affair. He likes to play with the game of pretending he's going to meet her and have an affair, and he's leading her on, but he's too timid to actually do anything as outrageous as commit adultery in Dublin in 1904. His wife is a little ballsier than he is in that respect. But readers a long time assumed that the woman's name, Martha Clifford, was her real name. And then somebody raised the question, if Bloom is using a false name, could she be using a false name too? So there's been a big hunt among the female characters in Ulysses to pick out the most likely suspect to be the one that Bloom is corresponding with. The current leading contender is Nurse Cahill, whom he meets in the maternity hospital, which makes their whole meeting absolutely hilarious. If you think she's the one he's been corresponding, neither one of them knows that the other is the one they've been corresponding. And that's very typical of the kind of humor that appears throughout Ulysses, mixed in with all the tragedy. Bloom's day is overcast by the funeral in the morning, which reminds him of his father's suicide and of the fact that his son died at only 11 days old. And so although Bloom is a basically cheerful person, there's an undertone of grief that keeps surfacing in his thoughts, and he always cheers up again. And if it isn't Nurse Cahill, it could be Blazes Boylan's secretary, whose first name is Martha, which makes for a very intriguing pattern because, as one Joyce scholar discovered in the Wandering Rocks chapter, when Boylan calls his secretary Martha, if you put it on the map of Dublin, the phone call, you draw the straight line between where she is and where Boylan is, it passes right through the part of Grafton Street where Bloom is standing at that time looking in a department store window. That is so much Joycean that I still suspect it's Boylan's secretary, which has another strange loop because if Boylan is having a real affair with Bloom's wife and Bloom is having a pretend affair with Boylan's secretary, it is another example of Joyce's general study of sexual nuttiness in Ireland. And there are dozens of unsolved problems like that, like the man in the brown Macintosh who shows up at Paddy Dingham's funeral. What makes this particularly intriguing is that Bloom seems to know almost everybody in Dublin. Bloom has had a variety of occupations, and Dublin was still a pretty small town in 1904. Yet he doesn't recognize the man in the brown Macintosh. So the man in the brown Macintosh can't be any of the important characters in the novel, all of whom Bloom knows. And yet the man in the brown Macintosh keeps reappearing. He darts across the street before the royal procession in the Wandering Rocks chapter. He shows up in the Cyclops chapter briefly, and when Bloom arrives at Lahore House at midnight, the man in the brown Macintosh is just exiting. And you never find out who he is or what his connection with Bloom is or what this series of coincidences mean. And there's been a lot of very ingenious interpretations of that, but I think its major function was to serve Joyce's message that the map is not the territory. He didn't read Koszybski, but he worked that out for himself. You can never know all about a single day or a single person. The man in the brown Macintosh may be Bloom's lost uncle, or he may have no connection with Bloom whatsoever. There are things you never will find out. That's the way the world seems to me, so I think Ulysses is closer to the world than any other novel before Ulysses.
Is there any indication that Joyce had studied, for example, the physics of the day? And
yeah. In his notes for the Ithaca chapter, it's quite clear that he is trying to write the chapter so that it fits Euclidean, Lobachevskian, and Gaussian geometry. The first sentence of the chapter, what parallel course did Bloom and Stephen follow? And that's from the cabman shelter to Eccles Street. I abbreviated the question. So it turns out that you work your way through the chapter that there are analogies with Euclidean, Lobachevskian, and Riemannian geometry. So in one sense, the two parallels, Bloom and Stephen, never meet. They're like in Euclidean geometry. In another sense, like in Lobachevskian, they meet. In another sense, like Lobachevskian, they get further and further apart. And Joyce did that because he didn't want the reader to be quite sure what the climax of the novel was. We never know the climax of a day. All we know for sure is Bloom is going to get breakfast in bed tomorrow morning. We know that. But we don't know what happens to Stephen after he leaves Bloom's. Bloom invites him to spend the night, and Stephen politely, courteously, but firmly declines and wanders off at 3 in the morning. Where does he go? He made up his mind he wasn't going back to the Martello Tower where Buck Mulligan is staying. He's not going to go back to his father's house where the kids are living in miserable poverty because the old man is drinking up all the money. Where is he going to go? We never find out. Stephen just wanders out of the novel and disappears entirely. Maybe someday somebody will find the clue that reveals where Stephen went. I prefer to think he wandered past Finn's Hotel and met a housemaid from Galway named Nora.
Joyce's mistress.
Nora Barnacle, yeah.
How much of Ulysses actually revolves around Joyce's mistress?
Well, a lot of people thought Nora Barnacle was the major model for Molly Bloom. When somebody asked Nora about that, she said, surely not, she's fatter than I am. Molly Bloom's language derives a great deal from Nora. Her biography derives from God knows what. Writers will frequently take 20 people they've known and 2 characters from novels they've liked in the process of creating a new character. You don't even know where your characters come from.
But isn't June 16th an important day in both the novel and in Joyce's life with Nora?
Yes. This is something a lot of Joyce scholars skate around nervously. They say June 16th was the day Joyce and Nora went for a walk together for the first time. Actually, as Joyce's letters to Nora in 1909, when she was still in Trieste and he went back to Dublin temporarily to open a movie theater, which he thought would make him rich, and he got cheated by his partners. June 16th, what actually happened is they walked on Sandymount Strand and Joyce made sexual advances and she gave him a hand job. So every year as Bloomsday gets bigger and bigger and leads to more and more tourist trade and enriches pious Catholic Ireland more and more, they are all celebrating a hand job, whether they know it or not. I think the hand job was so important to Joyce because based on all the biographical work that's been published so far, it was the first time in his whole life that he had an orgasm with a woman without paying for it. His whole sex life up until then had been entirely with prostitutes. Suddenly here was a woman who, out of sheer kindness and love, was willing to give him what he needed, an orgasm, a relief from sexual tension, whatever you want to call it. He fell in love with her and he stayed in love with her for the rest of his life.
Hadn't he actually had quite a bit of experience in whorehouses?
He started at the age of 14, and he was 22 when he met Nora, so I would say he had experience with quite a few prostitutes, yeah.
And June 16th is also the day that's covered in Ulysses?
Yes. He also arranged that those letters to Nora about their sex life, when they were separated, they wrote letters back and forth about their sex life to keep each other erotically aroused until they could meet again. And they wrote to each other about everything they did, everything they fantasized, and so on. And I think Joyce arranged that those letters couldn't be published until 25 years after his death, or 50 years after his death, I forget which. So he knew he was a classic. He never doubted it for a moment. Joyce was absolutely 100% sure he was the most important writer since Shakespeare. And he knew he was creating a whole new literature. He'd be the subject of endless PhD dissertations and so on. And he arranged that it would be long after he and Nora were both dead and gone, and Bloomsday would be established as a national holiday virtually before the Irish found out they were celebrating a hand job.